And we're on air. So good afternoon, and welcome to the first of the 2019 summer seminars from the Digital Classicist London series. We're extremely pleased to have Chelsea Gardner and Rebecca Seifried speaking to us today. They're going to talk, they're standing right here, they're going to talk about the CART-ography Project, cataloguing ancient routes and travels in the Mani Peninsula. And I think Chelsea will be doing most of the presentation, and we'll explain more about what that's.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for having us here. We're delighted to be the first in the seminar series, and thank you all for coming out on a Friday afternoon when the sun is shining. We really appreciate it. I'll be giving most of the presentation, but when we open up the floor to questions, Becky is a GIS specialist and will be able to answer a lot more of the technical questions. So I'll free you now. Perfect. So you're free to go. So a couple things I want to point out. We are on social media. Please feel free to live tweet if you'd like to, or tweet sporadically or however you want to. This is our hashtag CART-ography Project. The capitals don't actually matter on Twitter, so we could just do it all lowercase. I'm at Archaeoctopus, and Becky is at RM Seifried, so you can feel free to tag us. We're very open. We're very out there in the social media world, so feel free. Okay. Today, what we're going to be talking to you about is the CART-ography Project. I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of background information about how the project began and sort of where it's progressed over the past couple of years, as well as our goals for the project, broadly speaking. I'll then let you know a little bit about the study region, which is the Mani Peninsula right now. I'll give you some background information about the geography, the topography. Then we'll move into the travelers, both a list of general travelers who visited the Mani Peninsula, as well as honing in on specific examples of travelers whose routes we have analyzed in the past, as well as the routes that we will be ground truthing this summer. We'll then talk about the GIS methodology. I will provide a little bit of information about our initial methods that we are no longer using, but I think it's good to see sort of how the project evolved, where we began and where we are now. I'll then move into our refined procedures for GIS and a recent publication that we had on our methodology. Finally, and briefly, I'll talk about the 2019 field season, and it will be brief because it has not started yet. So this was actually fantastic timing for this seminar, because from here, I go to Edinburgh to study the archives of one of the travelers whose routes we'll be recreating, and then Becky and I meet again in Mani to undertake the field work. So you're sort of getting the first information about this project, and hopefully we have lots of exciting results for you in a few short weeks' time. So that's how this will go today. Okay. A timeline of the CART-ography Project. So starting at the bottom as in the earliest phases and leading to us today. I guess we should put like today here on the timeline. So the idea of this project, I guess, hadn't even really begun when Becky and I were field team members on the DeRose project. So the DeRose project is a multidisciplinary collaborative archaeological field project in the Mani Peninsula. It's centered around Alakotra Cave, which is a Neolithic cave site around DeRose Bay, hence the name DeRose. So Becky and I were field walkers beginning in 2011 for Becky and 2012 for me. And we eventually both found dissertation topics around the DeRose project and the Mani Peninsula more broadly speaking, more specifically actually. So we were active in fieldwork in the Mani Peninsula from 2011 to 2015. Becky finished her doctoral dissertation, Community Organization and Imperial Expansion in a Rural Landscape, the Mani Peninsula from 1000 to 1821 AD. So this is Byzantine and post-Byzantine settlement patterns and pathways is the focus of Becky's dissertation. Around this time, we realized that we were both using the same kinds of sources for our dissertation in terms of early modern travelers to inform us about the landscape of Mani throughout history. So neither of our dissertations, and you can see mine's a little further up, it took me a couple more years to finish my dissertation than Becky. So we'll have, a little bit later, a little higher up on the chart here. But both of us, even though our topics were pretty disparate in terms of chronological time frame, we were both using the same travelers, and we both really relied heavily on these travelers' accounts to the Mani Peninsula to inform us of the archaeological remains that were there. So the ideas for the cartography project started percolating around then. By 2017, we'd come up with the idea to actually plot out some of the travelers' routes in the Mani. We plotted them out. We wanted to see, are they the same? Are they different? Are there trends? Are they avoiding major roads that we would expect them to take? Are they taking the rate of major roads that we'd expect them to take? What kinds of archaeological remains are they noticing? Started asking these questions. Becky conducted some preliminary GIS analyses, and we presented a poster at the American Society for Oriental Research in November of 2017. At this point, Cartography Project was not named. It did not exist as of yet. The response to the poster was overwhelming. People loved it. We actually received the Joy Ungerleider Poster Award at ASOR that year, and we realized, okay, we've got something here. We should really pursue this. In 2018, just a few short months later, in January, we presented the results more fully in a paper at the Archaeological Institute of America annual meeting. And shortly after, we applied for funding through the Archaeological Institute of America and the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, the joint Anna C. and Oliver C. Colburn Fellowship. And it was at that point that we said, we've got to come up with a name for this project. And so we contacted our very brilliant friend, Danny Reby, who's excellent at coming up with names for papers and projects, and she helped us come up with the Cartography Project. So of course the CART is Cataloging Ancient Roads and Travelers. This allows us to branch out if we want to go beyond the Mani Peninsula. So that's how it got its name. And then finally, after that, I finished my doctoral dissertation. Again, it took a little while, but we're done that. And so you can see that in contrast to Becky's Byzantine and post-Byzantine, I concentrated on antiquity in the Mani Peninsula. So I worked on the Archaic through the Roman period. So we had a nice swath of history covered between the two of us. We slowly began to chip away at our travelers, at the records, at their diaries, their archives, their publications. And in 2019, just in January, we published an article with the Journal of Archaeological Science Reports with the revised GIS methodology that I'll be presenting to you shortly today. And what we used Colonel Leake's account for that methodology. And I'll talk a little bit more about why we use Leake's account. But in short, it's because of the incredible detail that Leake provides, and we were able to perform procedures in GIS that we would have been unable to do or unable to compare if we hadn't done it with Leake. And so here we are. This is us now. We're at the top of the timeline, and the Cartography Project begins its inaugural field season on June 16th. I guess is our first day. That's when we fly into Athens. We'll drive down to Mani. And so this summer, what we're doing is ground truthing the results of our GIS procedures. So what we did with Leake, we will do with Pausanias' route through Mani and Patrick Leigh Fermor's route through Mani. And then we are going to walk it. We're going to see whether, see what we see when we're down there. Okay, so let's talk about some questions. Let's talk about some questions and goals for the project. So when we set out, one of the questions that we had was, how reliable are ancient and modern travelers' accounts for understanding a given archaeological landscape? These are very open-ended questions, and of course, they're going to be very difficult answers, right? Every traveler's account is going to be different, but we're especially interested in the gaps in travelers' accounts. We wanted to know especially what they didn't record and the empty spaces on the landscape. How do these main routes of movement compare to the physical landscape and the archaeological sites we now know exist? So filling in this data with our empty spaces on a map, but also comparing their routes with modern thoroughfares and roadways that have been put into place. So this is where the GIS comes in, and are the routes, are the procedures that we're able to generate through GIS comparable to sort of the paths that have been put in by modern roads? These are very general questions as we set out. What value might they, that is travelers' accounts, lend to our knowledge of the sites and areas that these travelers intentionally bypassed or avoided? So once again, we're interested in the areas that travelers didn't go. And this will become more clear throughout today's presentation, and again, throughout the project in general. because we start our early modern travelers with Pausanias. He's our first in terms of our project, and he's arguably the most important because many of our travelers go to the Mani Peninsula with Pausanias in hand. And so this becomes especially informative if they're all missing the same places. If people are following Pausanias so blindly, let's say, that they too are not seeing or missing the same things that Pausanias missed. So again, we're interested in here is on that. Our goal is very broad: to assess the value of travelers' records in reconstructing archaeological landscapes. So that's where we are right now. Okay, let's talk about Mani a little tiny bit. So you can see from the map here, here's Greece, and this tiny little outline below is the Mani Peninsula. It is the central of 3 peninsular projections off of the southern Peloponnese. Affectionately, we like to call it the middle finger of Greece. It sticks out right into the Mediterranean Sea. It is dry, it's arid, it's rocky, it's largely inhospitable. There are not a whole lot of natural water sources. It's basically a tough region in which to subsist and thrive. The study area is demarcated by the red line you see on the slide here. Mani today is generally broken up into 3 areas: the outer exo-Mani, the inner or meso-Mani, and the lower or Cato-Mani. So our study region encompasses Meso-Mani and Cato-Mani. So collectively south of the modern town of Githio, which was the ancient Spartan port. And here is a view of this landscape. You can see lots of olive trees, lots of rocks, and that's about it. That's what we expect from Mani. Here, here's a terrain map and this lovely Views of the Earth by Christopher Horman image, which I think really shows the topography that we're dealing with. So the Tagatos mountain range projects south of Sparta and essentially splits the peninsula in 2. So it goes all the way down the peninsula, as you can see here, and of course in the terrain map as well. On the western side of the peninsula, there are much flatter areas, as reflected in both of these images, right? So this is where, I suppose even before we started this project, while we were still in the early stages of our dissertations, this is where we expected there to be, more settlements. And as the Cartography project progressed, this is where we expected there to be more travelers journeying. This is also the route that Pausanias took down this western coast. Yes, so you can see the Tagatos mountain range projecting all the way down where it terminates on the promontory of Tainaron, and that's where the famous classical site, the sanctuary to Poseidon, and the entrance of the underworld is. I'm going to show you a couple images because I've shown you a lot of words and a lot of maps, but I want you to get a real feel for what Mani is like. This is Mani in April. It's lovely, it's green. There's even, I think we'd call those flowers and plants that are alive. But really and truly throughout most of the year, it is quite arid and rocky. So lots of cliffs, very few safe harbors. I'll show you a map that indicates where the harbors are. But it's quite hostile in terms of the landscape. Here's another view of the coast, and those are some salt pans. So if any of you have actually read Patrick Leigh Fermor's Mani, there's a very famous passage where he encounters salt pan workers, and they're collecting salt from there. And you can go there today. A few years ago, I actually encountered people still collecting salt. It was a little boy and his grandmother. It was wonderful to see. The vegetation of Mani beyond olive trees is not the friendliest. I wouldn't say. This is the ever-present maquis, which is the blight of all field walkers everywhere. It's quite painful and, again, omnipresent. And this is an image sort of to contrast that first green image. This is the height of summer. So everything's turned brown and it is quite dry. Finally, in terms of the other side of nature, the fauna, there's not a whole lot but goats and cows. There are actually a shocking number of cows in Mani. Many of them are up on mountains, which is a little odd. But you can see, I think this image really nicely illustrates sort of the hilly areas on the western side of the peninsula with the Tagatos behind. All right, so let's talk about access and movement into Mani. On the map on the left, what you're seeing here are viable routes into the Mani Peninsula. So if you're coming from Sparta and the Spartan plain, you're coming from the northeast. And access from Sparta to Githio, which is indicated by the topmost red anchor, is actually fairly easy. It's fairly straightforward. We don't have those mountains in the way, essentially. However, once you get to this plain and around Githio, there are only 2 or 3 options with which to traverse the peninsula back to this nice plain. You can see the arrow on the top left coming from the west. That is actually quite mountainous, and the road even today is very circuitous as it goes around those mountains. So it's very difficult to reach Mani overland. In terms of harbors, obviously we're talking about a peninsula, it's jutting out into the water, so there are lots of ways to access the land via the sea. However, there are not a whole lot of safe moorings. Porto Cayo down here is a very nice, deep, safe harbor. Oops. And then we have a few more, as you can see, on the east coast than the west coast. So this is a really interesting contrast where we have all of these areas that you can access Mani on the east via the water, and yet it's the west coast that has those nice sort of plains that can be better exploited for agriculture. So really the landscape's not working with you at any point. Oh, right, and the image on your right, the blue here is just showing you the modern roads that traverse the Mani Peninsula. So these are the only ways to get from east to west if you're walking along a road. So there are very few. The top go through very, very obvious mountain passes, and I'll come back to talking about them shortly. Then we have over the bottom here where there's a tiny little isthmus as it connects the promontory of Tyron with the rest of Mani.
Are they not center?
Oh yes, these aren't all the roads. These are just the east-west roads. Yeah, so there is a major road that connects Areopoli and goes all the way down the coast. Yeah, that's a great question. And you can drive up the eastern side as well. I wouldn't recommend it in a large bus. Just how I've done it, not optimal. Okay, so to give you an idea of how people lived and where they were spread out along the Mani Peninsula, these red dots all indicate our best approximations of ancient sites in Mani. Very few of these have actually been confirmed, either archaeologically or epigraphically. I think we're limited to Idolo in the northwest, Kinepolis in the southwest, and Tyneron. Again, many of these are attested by Pausanias, many by Pausanias alone. And again, it's our best approximation based on archaeological remains. This is a view of a villa at Tyneron on the promontory, very close to the ruins of the sanctuary to Poseidon. And up at the top here, these 2 images are a little bit more what you would expect driving through Mani in terms of the ancient material culture, which is spolia. So much of our known archaeological material and ancient material culture, I should say, from Mani is in the form of spolia, often built into churches. The star indicates DeRose. This is where our project took place, and you might find it interesting that along that western coast, there aren't as many settlements as one might expect, given the fact that it is the flattest and probably most agriculturally promising area within Mani. And the reason that DeRose was so interesting is because we do think that we have found another, I don't like to use the word site, but a place of interest, let's say, with archaeological material. When we did our surface survey, we found evidence of classical Hellenistic through late Roman pottery and possibly a building as well. And so much of this coast is begging for surface survey so we can get a more accurate picture of what the actual ancient remains are there. Becky and I, in our field work for our respective dissertations, have spent a lot of time wandering through Mani and reporting archaeological features and sites. But in terms of official systematic excavation, there's been very little that has been done to date in Mani. So those are our ancient sites. The ancient sites are still marked here by the red dots that you can see, but now added to them are the medieval and post-medieval sites. So these are the sites that Becky largely recorded in the fieldwork that she conducted for her dissertation. And you can see the number, it expands considerably in the medieval and post-medieval period. So we see what we would expect to see in terms of settlements along that coastal area on the west. However, we also see lots of settlements in mountains, which if you were just looking at a map and you were looking at the terrain and the topography, you might not expect, which is very, very interesting. The population of Mani really increased significantly in the medieval and post-medieval periods, and there was a huge strain on the land in order to try to eke out a living. And so almost, I mean, as far as the eye can see, as illustrated in this image here, are just vast systems of terracing so that people could get whatever they could out of the land. So the population certainly was at its peak during these periods and has decreased significantly in the modern period, although people are starting to move back to Mani, which is very exciting. All right, so moving sort of from Mani in general and access and movement, one of the things that is integral to our project are the pre-modern pathways and path networks of Mani. So this is also something that Becky did throughout her doctoral research, and that is documenting and mapping pre-modern paths throughout the peninsula. And this is going to be very important for our GIS methodology when it comes to the cartography project. So what you're looking at here is a caldereme, plural calderemia, and these are formalized stone paths that would have been used to make your way throughout the peninsula. The digitized pathways here include calderemia as well as more informal dirt paths and sort of that are enclosed by field walls. And I believe this image also, is there goat paths in here too, or no? Not in this one, okay. So you can see this digitized image is very important in terms of how people moved throughout the landscape. Right, and you can see, perhaps not surprisingly, where the elevation is the highest through the center of the peninsula, we don't have a whole lot of paths. And also, if you can think back to that slide I just showed you about movement across the peninsula, it is too, especially in the north, where you would expect it to be, right, where those roads are now. Okay, so let's get to our travelers. This is not a comprehensive list of the travelers who have visited Mani, but these are our primary accounts at this point. We're always working to expand the project, always thinking ahead to the future, what will the next step be? But for now, in terms of our travelers, we have Pausanias, who's our earliest, and Patrick Leigh Fermor, right? That's our latest, sandwiches all the rest of the travelers. In between, we have Cyriacus of Ancona in the 15th century, Fabiano Barbo in the 16th century, Evelia Celebi in the 17th century, and then our 19th century travelers, Colonel Leake, Henry Post, and Henry John George Herbert. We also have administrators, so people who are journeying to Mani specifically for tax purposes, to take records, to record settlements or villages, or in the case of the Expédition Scientifique de Malet, recording the geology and the archaeological remains and the flora and the fauna and everything. And these two provide very interesting data for us to incorporate in our analyses and the way that they moved. I'll come back and talk about them in a bit when we talk about Pausanias. So we have two Ottoman defters, tax lists, right? Is that, yeah, to say a tax list? There are three. Oh, I have two on here. What's the third year, do you know? 1715. Oh, well, imagine there's a line that says 1715 right here. And then we have a letter to the Duke of Nevers, and a settlement list by Roussel. So these aren't not in the same category as travelers per se, because they had very different intentions and they were going there specifically to record things. Whereas some of our travelers are there for the experience as much as to record what they see. So this is what we're working with. And then of course, if we zoom into our travelers list, Colonel Leake is whose records we used to develop the GIS methodology that I'll speak to you about shortly. And then of course, Pausanias and Patrick Leigh Fermor are what we're going to be working with this summer. All right, so before I get into this, I want to talk a little bit about the reputation of Mani and the Maniats today and sort of throughout history. So you're looking at Vathia, which is in the southwest of Mani, and this is a very, very beautiful, very picturesque, very traditional tower town. And this is sort of one of the things for which Mani has become very famous are the feuds. The tower towns and the villages which feuded with one another, sometimes for several generations. And they were brutal and awful, but this is perhaps what one can come to expect when there is only so much sustenance that the land can give you and way more people than the land is able to support. So this is very iconic and what one would expect of Mani. As we read the travelers' records, we see lots of references to them as notorious, as pirates, as brigands, as robbers. They have this reputation that is so feared that there is a much longer list of travelers who try to go to Mani and can't. Either people refuse to take them down into Mani, or they do try and they turn back very quickly. So it is notorious in terms of its landscape, but also for the people which inhabit Mani. And this is great because these are old images of Maniat warriors when people traveled. And this is an image of a gentleman from the Independence Day celebrations a few years back. So you can see very proud of their heritage. Okay, a little story. This is sort of an aside, but will hopefully help you understand how fierce the Maniats are. So this is DeRose Bay. This is where the DeRose project was centered. Alapotripa Cave is actually, let me move this aside, is actually right behind here. If you go along the road, the excavations associated with the DeRose project took place up here on the promontory. This entire area we surveyed as part of the survey with DeRose. Now, our field seasons were typically in June or July, and one day we attempted to have our field season cross over the July 1st date, and we're told that we couldn't stay in the hotel. It was booked up where we usually stay for our field work, and we found out that it was because there was a commemoration of the Battle of DeRose Bay in 1826. And so we're talking about Greek War of Independence. The Maniats played a very prominent role in the Greek War of Independence, and we had never heard about the Battle of DeRose Bay, so we wanted to learn more about it. And essentially, as the story goes, the Maniat men, the warriors, were up north in Kalamata fighting and waiting for the Turks to invade near Kalamata. And so they had basically deserted the Mani Peninsula, leaving only the women and the children behind. And so the Turkish army thought, well, this is an opportunity if I've ever heard of one. And they sailed into DeRose Bay, ready to attack and ready to take the Mani Peninsula by force, decimating it, and then basically attacking the Mani forces from the south, which they wouldn't have been expecting. In an exchange of letters, we see this lovely response. The inhabitants of Mani say, "From the few Greeks of Mani and the rest of the Greeks who live there, to Ibrahim Pasha, we received your letter in which you try to frighten us, saying that if we don't surrender, you'll kill the Maniats and plunder Mani. That's why we are waiting for you and your army. We, the inhabitants of Mani, sign and wait for you." So the Turks invaded, and essentially what happened, and you can see this commemorated in this statue that stands in DeRose Bay, is that the women fought back. And they fought back so fiercely that they fought off the Turkish army, and they had to recede and sail away. And this was an incredible triumph, as you can imagine, for the Maniats, and they're very, very proud of it today. When we finally were able to start our field season that year, it was after the celebration of DeRose Bay, and we were swimming. I mean, you saw that image. Look at how beautiful it is there. We were swimming. We were about here looking up to the promontory when we saw this image clinging to the side of the promontory, which was pretty terrifying, I will say, because we certainly thought that there was, a dead body and we were going to have this whole investigation. So we clambered up to the side and investigated, and it was our dear Kukla, is what we call her. But as part of the celebration, they actually reenacted throwing Maniat women, this is our effigy here, off the promontory as part of the celebration. They didn't throw hard enough and this one got stuck, which is why we saw it. But this is very much a part of Mani identity today. They are very proud of their fierce warrior heritage. So that's a little bit of an aside to show you that this feeling is very strong still. A couple quotes for you from some of our early travelers. So JDS Morit of Rokeby did not make it into the Mani, not all the way down. He wanted to go all the way to Tyneron. He did not make it. So he says, as he's traveling around Lacedaemonia, there's little or no risk except the province of the Mina. This is south of Sparta and includes the two promontories of Malea and Tyneron. It is habited by the Greeks, the real descendants of the Lacedaemonians. And they have in this corner resisted all the efforts of the Turks, to whom they pay neither tribute nor obedience, and who dare not approach the country. They are all robbers, or rather pirates, and infest these seas with small armed boats, which pillage all the small craft from port to port. And in another letter later, as they are under little government and part of them ignorant and poor, those who inhabit the promontory of Tyneron sometimes commit such plunder out of their own territories that at Kalamata they are dreaded beyond measure. So their reputation precedes them. Henry Post, who did make it into Mani, he did manage to journey down, says that he was dressed up as a stranger in the hated guise of a Frank in a country of robbers in the secluded retreat of a robber chieftain whom I had ill-treated in the midst of desperate men whose profession was rapine and violence and completely within their power to deal with me as they thought fit. So he was very, very scared as he's traveling throughout Mani, and this comes through in his writings. And you notice the year, this is just 1 year from the Battle of DeRose Bay. Okay, so now you have an image, an idea of Mani. You have an idea of the topography, you have an idea of the people, you have an idea of the history of the travelers. So let's talk about what we're doing with cartography. Our initial GIS methodology was very, very simple. Essentially, we digitized each stop that a traveler took. So this is Pausanias that you're looking at here as a waypoint. So every place that they went to, we did our best to approximate where it was. Obviously, with Pausanias, it's a little more difficult than, say, Leake, who is using modern town names, or at least relatively recent town names. And we had to make decisions in places like this, where the last recorded spot is modern-day Kotronas, and for Pausanias, until he gets to Tyneron. And so our assumption there is that he took a boat to Tyneron, not that he journeyed all the way down this eastern side of the peninsula, which is very mountainous and very difficult to journey down. I'll come back to that. Then what we did was we created a cost raster based on the slope and the known paths. So you see a digital elevation model that shows you the terrain, and the slope is calculated from here. Here we go, this is the image I was looking for that has all of those calderinia as well as goat paths. So these are integrated, and you see a cost raster that is a combination of where the paths are and the terrain, the elevation itself. So Becky developed this. And then, very, very simply, we just used a least cost procedure, least cost path analysis to model the journeys. So this is, again, Pausanias. You can see here are the waypoints, and here is the least cost journey. This map is essentially made without any sort of tweaking whatsoever. You push a couple buttons, you get a least cost path, and this is what it looks like. So this is what we're seeing here. And again, we've left the maritime journeys as we assumed they would have occurred. We did this for all of our, I think we did eight initial travelers and administrators, actually, we did. And we found some interesting trends that led us to realize that we needed to improve our least cost path procedures, because they weren't giving us the results that we knew to be true. So for example, for both Cyriacus of Ancona and Evlia Chelebi, you'll see that the least cost path pushed both of these routes through the mountains, when in reality, this pass, this is the mountain pass I showed you earlier with that road, almost certainly would have been where they would have traveled. It's just very, very unlikely that they would have gone over such an incredible elevation. So of course, some of the limitations to GIS are that you can't be there with the traveler and think about the human decision that they might have made at the time. But we are fairly certain that simply plugging in a least cost path and analyzing the route that way was not sufficient, that we needed to take that one step further. So this is the poster actually from ASOR, and this was the preliminary GIS analysis. This is what it looked like, and this is a compilation of all of the different travelers' routes that were a result of the simple least cost path, as well as all the settlements that are mapped along it. So just to give you an idea of where we started. So one of the interesting things about Pausanias and about this very simple output, and our assumption that we think he took a boat along the east coast of the peninsula, is because there's this site indicated by the red star called Chaonia. Chaonia just means columns. It's always known an ancient name. And it's just called Chaonia because we don't know what ancient site this is. And in fact, it wasn't until the Expédition Scientifique de Malet in the 19th century traveled to this area that this site was discovered. And this is truly unusual because, I have another image of it here. Yes. Even though this might not look very impressive, this is by far our best preserved religious architecture in all of Mani. And if you know anything about Pausanias, he loves himself some religious architecture. And he didn't record this. So why didn't he walk down to see this? Did he know it was there? Did it exist at that point? We don't know. These are the kinds of questions that we can't answer, but really solidifies our hypothesis that he didn't walk here, that he did take a boat, because presumably had he made that perilous journey along the east coast, at some point someone might have pointed that out to him or he might have found it. But this is very interesting because, remember, Expédition Scientifique de Malet doesn't occur until the 19th century. They're the first to discover it. All of those other travelers I showed you were probably, you know, Pausanias in hand, traveling down the peninsula and looking for the sites that he mentioned. He either didn't know about this or didn't mention it, and so none of our other travelers do, which is very interesting. So again, these are sometimes downfalls of using travelers' accounts to identify archaeological remains in any given region. This site, truly the best preserved religious architecture in Mani, went unknown until the 19th century. Here it is mapped, as you can see, and I'll show you some of the remains of the architectural members around it. The best, this is Winter and Winter published this in the 70s, and the best guess is that these are two separate temples, one Hellenistic and one Augustan, but they really need further study. I'd love to do more study there. Okay, so the refined GIS methodology. So this came out, if you have any questions about this, we're happy to talk about it in Q&A, but it was also the subject of the JASR paper that came out in January. So like I said, we used Leake's journey in 1805 to refine our methodology. With the route that we ended up generating, we used procedures that incorporated both slope and or paths. So some of the procedures only focused on slope. Some of the procedures only focused on the paths and the path network that had been digitized. Some of the procedures focused on both of them together. Because Leake was a responsible military government man, he recorded the times it took to get from place A to place B, which meant that when we were running these procedures, we could do time-based algorithms and we could compare the results of those with the actual time that it took Leake to walk from point A to point B. So this is why we refined our methodology using Leake's account, because it was so specific. Some of the functions that we used were Tobler's function, the modified Tobler function, and Naismith's rule with the Aitken-Langmuir corrections. I don't know if I'm saying that properly, but sure. Here are Leake's waypoints. So just as in with all of our travelers, the places that they stop become waypoints in our analyses. So there's his. And these are the different paths that were generated through the different procedures that we ran. So it's all Leake. So it goes to show, I mean, depending on, you know, the different functions that you run, your paths could be sometimes similar, sometimes very different. When you look at the mountain paths when they're traversing from east to west, that's where we see our biggest discrepancy. And in some areas, it's, you know, pretty much just one line. Very, very small deviations, I should say. Okay, so I want to show you just one tiny little case study, and that's Leake's journey from Areopoli to the church at Glezu. This is also conveniently right near where we did our field work, so we really know this area very well. And we know generally how one would travel from point A to point B. Importantly, Leake also says specifically that he does not go to the town of Pyrgos Diru. And so we know based on that, that any path that generates, or any path that has him going through Pyrgos Diru is not going to be correct. So here's where our human opinions come into play. Okay, so what you're looking at here are our 8 different procedures that we ran. Okay, so you can see in the top left corner of each of the slides, they correspond to each other. So A is A, B is B, C is C, and etc. The plus signs, the little black and white circles with the plus signs, those are the towns of Haria and Pyrgos Diru. Based on his account, we know, as I mentioned, that he did not go to Pyrgos Diru and that he only passes by Haria, presumably on the eastern side of Haria on his way to Glezu, to the church at Glezu. On the left, you're seeing cost, wherein the red is higher terrain and therefore higher cost. This is flipped on the right slide, where you have the red as actually the lower cost. Again, we're happy to answer more questions about these different graphs, but I want to show you this because a couple of the paths were immediately eliminated because of what we knew from Leake's account, right? So if you look at A and B, they're going between Haria and Pyrgos Diru, and we just knew that that wasn't the case. Ultimately, we settled on the modified Tobler, and we used slope and paths. We found that to be our best option. The difference here between the paths themselves is that this is generating a path from Areopoli to Glezu, whereas these are called corridor analyses, and what they're doing is finding the best way from both points to each other. So that's why it's a corridor, right? So you're two-way traffic. So this is what we settled on here in terms of our methodology. How are we doing for time? Good. Here I want to show you again, because we know the time that Leake spent getting from Areopoli to Glezu, we could use that as a baseline and then see how each of these different paths, so you can see how they correspond here, how much they deviated from the actual time it took Leake to walk from one place to the next. So that was also very, very helpful. Again, generating this methodology for our most complete account in the hopes that it can accurately reflect our accounts that are much less detailed than Leake's. And this is the final, so I showed you that one tiny area between Areopoli and Glezu, but this is the final path that we settled on in terms of our procedure. So there's still a few areas that we're uncertain about, but especially down here in our Tyneron Peninsula where the exact route is unknown, but we're pretty confident in this, and this methodology is what we're going to be using to produce our GIS paths of Patrick Fermor and Pausanias routes this summer, and then we will ground truth it. So we'll actually be walking them to see, are the landmarks the same? Does this make sense? Would this be a decision that a human would actually make? Or does this, is there a clear road right here that we're not seeing and we're walking up a mountain? So that's the refined methodology. One thing I do, as I sort of conclude here, one of the things that I want to mention before I talk about our summer field work is the importance of just walking in the landscape and not restricting yourself exclusively to the written records. Particularly if our hypothesis that many of our early modern travelers were carrying around a copy of Pausanias is true. And that's because there are a lot of sites in the landscape, this will come as a surprise to no one in the audience, that haven't been recorded. And the Tyneron promontory, oftentimes also called the Matapan promontory, was especially difficult to get to. And most people wanted to find the Cave of the Dead, the Temple of Poseidon, they wanted to go there. And very, very close to the promontory, to the Matapan Peninsula at the very south of Mani, is this site, which is an early modern settlement, but it has a rock-cut cistern and copious amounts of classical to Hellenistic pottery, which is very, very, very close to Tyneron, to the site that we know as Tyneron today. It's just, a couple hundred meters north of here. But this is why sort of combining the actual landscape with the traveler's records we think is so important, and all of these empty spaces are going to help fill in the landscape in its entirety. Okay, so as I finish up, I want to talk about the summer 2019 goals. So yeah, it's our inaugural field season. We're very excited about this. We'll be conducting our best attempts at a social media campaign and posting about our journey as we go through. But essentially, we want to ground truth the results of our GIS analysis for Patrick Leigh, Fermor, and Pausanias to see whether they correspond and whether they're realistic. We chose these two for a couple of reasons. They take opposite routes throughout the peninsula, so we thought that would be very interesting. And we also, I mean, when we were applying for funding for this project, Becky and I were both, well, I hadn't finished my dissertation yet. Becky had, but we were still, early career scholars, still are early career scholars. We hadn't secured any institutional funding. And so this was at the same time we created the name CART-ography Project, and we wanted to do something exciting that people would be interested in. And Pausanias and Patrick Leigh Fermor, not only the nice alliteration that you have there, it bookends our travelers, and it's a way to get people, I think, interested in the project. So we'll be documenting climate, elevation, terrain, and viewshed as we travel around the peninsula. And as I say, we'll be posting about this using the CART-ography Project hashtag. As a side project, I'll also be replicating Joan Leigh Fermor's photographs that she took as she journeyed throughout the peninsula as sort of, again, a side project of interest, but also to see the sort of the changing nature of the landscape of Mani for the last 50 or so years. And to finish with Patrick Leigh Fermor, because I feel like I've talked about Pausanias a whole lot, and we haven't really talked about Patrick Leigh Fermor. Of course, he journeyed throughout Mani and wrote a famous book about his travels through the peninsula, and about the people and the customs and the history of the place. And so this is it's a very personal project, but it's also, I think, one that will be of interest to the people in Mani as well, and it will be a nice connection to forge. It's also just fortuitous that the Leigh Fermor House will be opening this summer for visits, so it's a nice coincidence, I suppose. And Joan Leigh Fermor's photographs, some of her photographs were recently published in the volume, which is also very nice. And yes, the last thing that I wanted to talk about was next week we'll be looking at the Leigh Fermor archives, which are housed in the National Library in Scotland in Edinburgh. So what's really great about this is that we have Mani, right? We have the book Mani, written by Patrick Leigh Fermor, and how he documented his journey. But by looking at the archives, we can also see where he actually went and whether that differs from the published account, which I think will be very interesting to see. This is, of course, the salt pans, the famous salt pans on the Tigani Peninsula called frying pan. I think you can see why. So that's where we are right now. Preliminary stages, very, very excited about the future of the project, and more than happy to answer any and all questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Chelsea, for giving us this overview of a fascinating and very exciting project, I think. And it feels quite a privilege to be sort of getting in, this early step of the project. So I hope you'll come back in a couple of years and tell us more about the progress of this.
Absolutely.
This is very cool. So, shall we keep the YouTube
broadcast
on for the first couple of questions?
Sure.
As we said at the beginning, and then
Absolutely.
So, if anyone has any questions, please ask loudly and clearly if you can.
Well, I have a couple of comments because I know a little bit about this. Rumor has it that you are going to be bypassing the first part of the Fermor journey.
That's right.
And no likelihood of changing your mind?
Yes, so he starts in Sparta and climbs over the Taygetos Mountains and ends up on the western side of the peninsula and sort of makes his way down to Cartamili, which is eventually where he builds his house, and then takes the boat into Limeni, the Itilo area, and that's where Becky and I are starting, where he takes the boat in. I mean, you've been to Mani in July. So climbing over the Tiger Toes Mountains in July. That is true. That is true. We thought about it. We did consider it. You know, starting from the beginning.
He essentially referred to Mani as a hellscape. I mean, so we're not super excited.
We talk about the lack of water and how hungry and thirsty he is as he's like climbing through the Tiger Toes.
If a version master could do it, it's quite the
That's true. That's true. Okay, our official excuse for not starting where Patrick Leigh Fermor starts is because our study region ends just north of Idolo.
Yeah.
So that's our official excuse.
The other point about the Fermor, as you know, is that his writing when it comes to identification, when you've been looking at Leake or one of the other travelers, you come to Leigh Fermor and you try to work out where on earth he's writing about. He was not averse to some romantic injections. As indeed he was saying that it's journey to Constantinople. So I have looked, he mentions a tower near Molinas. I cannot find it. He mentions it very clearly in black and white. So it would be fascinating to hear how far you can track his routes, even with the aid of the archives in Edinburgh, which I've looked at as well.
Mm-hmm. I think part of one of the challenges of this project will certainly be acknowledging the limitations within the texts themselves. But you're right, this is the liberties that Patrick Leigh Fermor was known to have taken within his writing was the reason that we went to the archives to see if there were any major discrepancies. I think the first one that you noticed, Becky, was it a Paleomaniatica that he hadn't mentioned in the book? So that's a whole other landmark that we have as a result of looking in the archives, which is great for us, and who knows how many more of those we'll come across.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, absolutely, we have to take everything with a grain of salt. And while 50 years is, relatively recent in the grand scheme of time, especially when we're looking at Pausanias as one of our other travelers, the landscape still will have changed, and there will be landscape buildings will have changed, and things will be different, especially as Mani becomes more popular as a tourist destination. So lots of things are being built up again, which is a little bit strange. Even over the last 6 or 7 years since we've started working there, it's changed, landmarks have changed, and buildings have changed a little. So yes, we will have to take everything with a grain of salt for sure.
Another thing that's worth mentioning, I should stand up.
Come stand so the computer can hear you.
Yeah, all right. So another thing that's worth mentioning about the Patrick Leigh Fermor's time when he visited the 1950s was before the major roads had been paved in Mani. So, when he got south of Itido, once he got into our study region, it was the only things that were walkable were calderemia, these stone cobbled roads that we saw a picture of. So those are some to some degree preserved, but a lot of them have actually been paved over. They were used as the basis for the modern roads. So part of the maps that Chelsea talked about before, where we trace the pre-modern roads, a lot of that had to do with looking at early 1940s historical aerial photographs from the Greek military. So we tried as best we could to recreate what that road system was. And so we're going to walk it this summer. We might be walking on paved roads, imagining that we're walking on the calderemia below, but there are definitely points where it veers off, and we're going to traipse through the bushes because they're no longer walked today. We're going to do our best. So
And
it's
it
also
has on the
worth
video, of
mentioning.
course, because it says tourists will never come here.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you for mentioning that. I forgot about that. That aspect of it. So unfortunately, a lot of it's gone. But some are still. I mean, you saw some of the photos. There are some pictures that have been preserved, which is great.
And I sent you the American ones.
Pardon me.
I sent you the American ones,
The American.
and there are more of those. The American ones?
Where? The American photographs.
Oh, visually.
Yeah.
The area ones.
Right.
Yeah. And there are more area ones of Boston.
That's great. Yeah, it was very recently that the roads were paved. That's very long ago.
That's also been a fun aspect of our, the fact that we started working there in 2011. We've been able to make friends with the family that we stay with, and so the elderly generation remembers using these caldorimia. So they use them to walk to school, for example. And so we can also use their testimonies to figure out where these roads were that are no longer there.
So I guess that's my question. What's the mapping like from this 18th, 19th century of the area? Because I remember years ago coming across Austrian naval maps, which showed all these parts, but I couldn't find them. I went there because obviously they don't exist anymore.
I don't think there's any equivalent to the Austrian maps, unfortunately. So the French expedition.
Which there's no equivalent to them. What do you mean? Sorry.
So the Austrian maps, they didn't map this part of Greece that I know.
I think
The
I
Peloponnese.
think there are Austrian naval maps which map the paths across the army.
Okay.
Because
I would love to find out.
We need to
I think they're from
we need to find ourselves.
the 19th century. I traced them years ago.
That's
I
wonderful.
I couldn't find the paths at the time.
Let's talk about that.
Yes. Yes. The more maps, the better. The more records
Well,
of these
because
roads,
they
the
were
better.
actually showing routes between villages.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
I don't know how reliable they were, trustworthy.
But you work with what you got.
Why would the Austrians be happy?
Austrian, I don't know. And my history on the Austrian Empire and southern Greece is not great. So I'm finding the libraries, so years ago. So.
Yeah, well, just
As part of the French expedition in the 1820s, they did produce a very detailed map of the Peloponnese, and it does have roads and routes marked on it, but they're very generalized. So when I compare them to the physical landscape, I mean, it can help us say it's probably this road they're referring to, but it's not spatially accurate, you know. And they only detail the major roads, not the little field paths. So hopefully that seems like a more detailed resource.
Okay. Well, I'll think around and see if I can find any trace of it. Congratulations.
yeah. Oh, sorry.
We're like in a direct line. The view shed.
That's right.
Now, what's interesting in this process that you mentioned about travelers replicating the travel of previous travelers, because that's something that I've seen a lot in Pompeii too. And I wanted to know if you have found, or if you're anticipating irrational routes that, you know, it would have been easier to do something else, but because they were following Pausanias, for example, they went another way. Did you find evidence of something like that?
I'm trying to think about maybe in the northeast of the peninsula. There's a pretty high concentration of archaeological remains as you come into the peninsula from the northeast, because that's still the continuation of the plain of Githio. So it's less mountainous, and there are just a higher density of known remains. And I think when we were doing even some of the Leake mapping, there's a lot of back and forth. So there's a lot of like, I want to go here, and then I want to go back to Githio, and then I want to go here, and then I want to go back. And it's not as, you know, if you were doing it, looking at a map without any preconceived notions of where you should be going, you might do a more direct path and hit all of these places rather than kind of like a circuit back and forth, or like a wheel, I guess, a wagon wheel going back and forth. That's the place I can think of the most. Certainly, if we had relied on those least cost paths across the mountains, that wouldn't have made sense. But in terms of where they are going, no, there's not really anywhere that's difficult to get to, because it seems like Pausanias went to the easiest places to go. So I mean, he walked when it was easy to walk, and then he got on a boat when it was difficult. And so maybe those travelers who walked all the way down to Tainaron, because it seems like Pausanias took a little bit of a boat detour around that area, they might be doing a little bit more, it's a little more difficult than they could have been doing it. But I don't know, those are the only examples I can think of. Is there anything?
I think that image that we had with the 8, you know, different algorithms that we tried, and showing the accumulated cost surface and the corridor analysis, showed that if you just rely on like least cost path and don't know anything and don't input any preconceptions, the easiest way would have been to kind of go down into the little river valley and then back up again. So if you're just using that as a predictive tool, you're not necessarily going to mimic the actual route that, in this case, this particular traveler took. And that's because there were other considerations. He wanted to avoid certain settlements. So this will be something that we can consider as we're walking and probably walking back because we parked the car somewhere. We can think about trialing different, what if I wanted to avoid all people? Like, is there anywhere I can walk where people can't see me? Probably not, but this would have been a major concern for travelers in the region, whether they were local or not. Especially something that maybe we didn't talk about so much was the vendetta, which is very common in the early modern period. So there's documented evidence of people in different villages feuding with each other or within the same village. And so people, especially men, were at high risk of being shot if they were seen while they moved about the landscape. So visibility is one of the major concerns as people were moving.
One of the examples I can think of an unintentional difficult path was Paddy Leigh Fermor when he sailed into Porto Cayo, I think, and there was a problem with the ship and had to basically climb up and over the mountains, the central Taiguatos, to get back to the Bafia area. And this is where he runs into the shepherd girl who brings them to that area. But that is never a path that anybody should ever walk. I mean, that's about as brutal as it gets. And so if you were to plug that in from Porto Cayo to Bafia in just a general least cost path, I don't think it would ever take you straight up and over. But they did, and they had a mule take their stuff, and they walked, and that's pretty...
Yeah, we see in this image going from point 13 to 14, it actually prefers to wrap around the mountain rather than go over. He went over.
He went over, yeah. Yes.
This is so awesome, and thank you guys so much for sharing. I have a question. My question is, I don't know. I know this is like just the beginning stages, and I'm so excited about like where this project is going to go. The question is about like the kind of do you guys see like as you go into this landscape and like keep working back and forth between the sources and the topography, that kind of like bifurcating of your data set into the landscape that you're recording in these like literary landscapes that you're looking at. So I was really struck by the parallel. I've been working on a chapter about Russian travelers to the Caucasus in the 19th century, and they were all also carrying books, but they were carrying Pushkin and Tolstoy accounts of the Caucasus, which are of course like fictional-ish. And I was thinking about Sue Alcock has written about like the use of the kind of use and abuse of Pausanias, right? And it's a literary source. It's like meant to be a enjoyable account of a journey with a lot of literary tropes in it, right? So I'm just curious, like, I want to know, just completely selfishly, like, what would be like a parallel technique by which you would kind of start mapping the like least cost, like paths of least cost between these imagined landmarks within those sources, right? Where people were like, oh, I could write about like how I actually walk, but like Pausanias already like described it in like such a captivating way. I'm just gonna say that I also like walked over the mountain and met a shepherdess, and then like kind of. Yeah.
No, that's super interesting, especially as like Pausanias, while he's moving through this landscape, he's talking about places all over the Mediterranean world, and so that's really interesting in terms of the imagined, what you're seeing, what you're visualizing, where you actually are versus what you're thinking about. But I think a really nice contrast is that we know that Leake had Pausanias. Like Leake loved Pausanias and says, "I have him with me," but Leake is our most, rigid and like record-keeping guy, and so that's a really nice contrast because we have Leake's account that is, I walked from here to here, and it took this long, and this is a town I saw, this is a town I saw, this is a town I saw. So he has Pausanias, loves Pausanias, but like his military background is so ingrained that he's like, but I have to write about things that aren't in Pausanias. So that's like a nice contrast. But you're right, with the others, like Cyriacus of Ancona, like.
But also like the possibility that the like military, especially in the who is Leake again?
Leake is in the 19th century. They're like, yes.
And this sort of like 19th century, even like European military view of Greece was clearly like also like steeped in romanticism. So we end up having this like, especially in the sense that like you're not seeing what you saw, you're reading what you wrote.
Totally. Yeah, the big discrepancy that we continuously see is Pausanias and everybody else's desire to identify temples, right? Like this is the Temple of Artemis, this is the Sanctuary of Poseidon, this is this, and none of them have been identified. Maybe Poseidon on Tyron, but everything else is his. Maybe Pausanias was recording it as he actually saw it, but subsequently, like, we just don't know. Do these people have any idea that what they're seeing are those things? Are we talking about the same monuments? We're talking about 10 different monuments for 10 different travelers, and they're all identified as the Temple of Artemis. That's
Well, probably it's inlet, what you saw there, you didn't write and other people saw that.
But if there's multiple temples and none have been like identified securely, then
Well, there's only one temple of Cyriacus.
that's true. That is true.
Do we have lost sites that we know there should be somewhere on the map? Ancient times. Do we have names of places that are meant to be there somewhere?
We have more lost sites than we have known sites. So this is, that's a great question, and one of the issues with working in Mani, because of the lack of systematic excavation that has taken place there, the vast majority of these sites are our best guesses. So Ipola on the west coast here. This is up on a ridge called Cavo Grosso, and down on the hill of that ridge is a town named Kipula. So there are some ancient remains nearby, but no epigraphic attestations. We just don't know. And this is the case for the vast majority. So we've got, I mean, this Kinepolis is known. That we've got epigraphic evidence. Tyneron, pretty confident about that one. Other than that, Idolo for sure. But everything else is your best guess. You have a concentration of archaeological remains or high concentrations of spolia in a region, or the topography, Pausanias talks about rivers, let's say, and hey, there's 2 rivers right here, and these archaeological remains. So it's our best guess, but no, the vast majority of these sites are not concretely known. Yeah, makes it difficult for sure. Especially the Northeast. The Northeast, I would say, is the most fraught.
Can you turn off YouTube and then make a few
Sure,
more questions a bit more relaxed?
absolutely, yes.
Let me just turn this off. Thank you all for joining us, those of you who joined remotely.
you. Oh, they can't see me.
Um,
Wait a minute, now.
how do I turn this off?
My kid's watching.